The blizzard hit Fort Blackwater at 03:00 hours, turning what should have been a routine training exercise into a fight for survival. In the whiteout conditions of the Colorado Rockies, 8 elite Special Forces candidates found themselves trapped. On a ledge, their communications dead, their equipment failing, and hypothermia setting in fast. The strongest among them, the ones who had dominated every physical challenge, were helpless against nature's fury. But the person who would save them all was someone they had dismissed, someone they had laughed at, someone they said was too weak to even be there. This is the story of how Sergeant Lisa Chun proved that true strength isn't always measured in muscle mass or bench press records, and how one night changed everything everyone thought they knew about what it takes to be elite. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of Fort Blackwater as Corporal Marcus Thompson stepped off the transport bus, his duffel bag slung over his shoulder with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his own abilities. At 6 feet 3 inches and 220 pounds of pure muscle, Marcus had dominated every physical challenge the Army had thrown at him. His college football record still stood at State University, and his performance in basic training had been nothing short of legendary. Now, as he gazed up at the imposing peaks of the Colorado Rockies that surrounded the Special Operations Training Facility, he felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with a new challenge to conquer. Marcus had arrived at Fort Blackwater as part of the most selective training program in the military. Only 30 candidates had been chosen from thousands of applicants, and he knew he belonged among them. His test scores were perfect, his physical fitness evaluations were off the charts, and his instructors had consistently ranked him as one of the most promising soldiers they had ever encountered. This was his moment to prove what he had always known about himself, that he was destined for greatness, that he was built for the kind of elite operations that most people could only dream about. The other candidates were already gathering near the main barracks, and Marcus could immediately assess his competition. There was Private Jake Wilson, a lean former marathon runner whose endurance was legendary, but whose upper body strength Marcus knew he could easily overpower. Private Amanda Foster had impressive marksmanship credentials, but Marcus had already beaten her scores during their preliminary evaluations. Most of the others looked competent enough, but Marcus was confident that none of them possessed his unique combination of size, strength, and natural athletic ability. As the group was led toward the administrative building for initial processing, Marcus noticed someone who seemed completely out of place among the elite candidates. Walking slightly behind the main group was a small Asian woman in standard Army fatigues, carrying a clipboard and appearing to be handling some kind of administrative duties. She was probably 5 feet 4 inches tall and couldn't have weighed more than 130 pounds. Her black hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and she moved with a quiet efficiency that suggested she was comfortable in her support. "Roll," Marcus nudged Jake Wilson, who was walking beside him. "Check out the admin clerk," he said with a smirk. "Wonder what she did to get stuck babysitting us elite candidates." Jake glanced over and shrugged, but Marcus continued his assessment. The woman looked like she belonged in an office somewhere, not on a military base designed to forge the hardest soldiers in the world. Her slight frame and unassuming demeanor were exactly the opposite of everything Marcus associated with military excellence. The administrative building was a modern structure that housed the command offices and briefing rooms where the candidates would receive their initial orientation. As they filed into the main briefing room, Marcus found himself studying the various personnel who would be overseeing their training. There was Colonel Patricia Hayes, the base commander, whose reputation for demanding perfection was known throughout the special operations community. Several tough-looking instructors were positioned around the room, their faces bearing the kind of weathered expressions that came from years of combat experience. What surprised Marcus was seeing the small Asian woman from outside now standing near the back of the room with what appeared to be equipment manifests. She was clearly some kind of support staff, probably responsible for tracking gear and maintaining inventory records. Marcus wondered briefly why someone so obviously unsuited for military operations would choose to work at a place like Fort Blackwater, but he dismissed the thought quickly. There were always people who wanted to be around elite soldiers even if they could never be elite soldiers themselves. Colonel Hayes stepped to the podium and began the orientation briefing. "Gentlemen and ladies," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect throughout her distinguished career. "You are here because you represent the best of what our military has to offer. Over the next 6 months, you will undergo training that will push you beyond every limit you thought you had. Some of you will succeed and join the most elite fighting forces in the world. Others will not. The difference between success and failure often comes down to understanding what true strength really means." As Colonel Hayes continued outlining the training program, Marcus found his attention drifting to the various personnel in the room. He noticed that several of the senior instructors occasionally glanced toward the back of the room where the small Asian woman was quietly organizing paperwork. There was something in those glances that Marcus couldn't quite interpret, a kind of respectful acknowledgement that seemed oddly out of proportion for someone in a support role. The colonel introduced the key training staff, each one a legend in their own right. There was Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had served in every major conflict of the past 20 years, and whose tactical knowledge was considered encyclopedic. There was Captain Morrison, whose marksmanship records had never been broken and whose patience with struggling shooters was legendary. Each instructor commanded immediate respect from the candidates, and Marcus felt honored to be learning from such accomplished professionals. But when Colonel Hayes mentioned that equipment coordination would be handled by Sergeant Chun, Marcus noticed something that struck him as unusual. The brief nod of acknowledgement that passed between the colonel and the small woman in the back of the room carried a weight that seemed inconsistent with a routine administrative function. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Marcus had always been observant about power dynamics, and this felt like something more than a superior acknowledging a subordinate. After the briefing, the candidates were divided into smaller groups for initial equipment issue and barracks assignments. Marcus found himself in a group being led by Sergeant Chun, who introduced herself with a quiet professionalism that immediately established her competence in logistics and administration. She walked them through the equipment issue process with remarkable efficiency, demonstrating comprehensive knowledge of every piece of gear they would be using during their training. "Each of you will be responsible for maintaining your equipment to the highest standards," Sergeant Chun explained as she guided them through the supply warehouse. "Equipment failures in the field can cost lives, so we expect perfect maintenance and immediate reporting of any problems." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her voice was calm and measured, and Marcus noticed that she seemed to know every piece of equipment in the warehouse, without referring to any manuals or reference materials. What struck Marcus as odd was the way Sergeant Chun handled some of the more sophisticated equipment. When she demonstrated the proper maintenance procedures for the advanced communication systems, her knowledge seemed to go far beyond what would be expected from someone in a support role. She explained complex technical concepts with the fluency of someone who had extensive field experience, and she answered detailed questions about equipment modifications and field adaptations with surprising expertise. Marcus found himself watching Sergeant Chun more closely as she continued the orientation. Despite her small stature and quiet demeanor, she moved through the warehouse with a kind of purposeful efficiency that suggested extensive familiarity with military operations. When she lifted heavy equipment boxes, she did so with a technique that spoke of proper training and considerable strength relative to her size. Her explanations of field procedures were detailed and practical, clearly based on real experience rather than theoretical knowledge. The first few days of training confirmed Marcus's expectations about his own capabilities. He dominated the physical fitness evaluations, posting scores that exceeded the requirements by significant margins. His performance on the obstacle courses was flawless, and his natural leadership abilities quickly established him as the unofficial leader among the candidates. During combat training exercises, his size and strength advantages were obvious, and he consistently outperformed his fellow candidates in scenarios that required physical dominance. But there were aspects of the training that puzzled Marcus. During tactical planning sessions, he noticed that several of the senior instructors would occasionally glance toward the back of the room, where Sergeant Chun was typically organizing training materials. These glances seemed to carry a significance that Marcus couldn't understand, as if they were seeking some kind of approval or acknowledgement from someone who should have been irrelevant to the training process. The puzzle deepened during a particularly challenging navigation exercise. The candidates were required to move through difficult mountain terrain using only basic compass and map skills, and Marcus had struggled with some of the more complex route-finding challenges. When he returned to base, he overheard a conversation between Master Sergeant Rodriguez and Captain Morrison about the exercise design. "The route through Devil's Canyon was brilliant," Captain Morrison was saying. "I never would have thought to use that approach, but it tested exactly the skills we needed to evaluate." Master Sergeant Rodriguez nodded and glanced toward where Sergeant Chen was reviewing exercise results. "She has a gift for designing scenarios that reveal character under pressure," he replied. "That's what makes her recommendation so valuable." Marcus felt a flicker of confusion. The conversation seemed to suggest that Sergeant Chun had been involved in designing the training exercises, which would be far beyond the scope of someone in a support role. But before he could think about it further, the instructors moved on to other topics, and Marcus dismissed the overheard conversation as a misunderstanding. The physical demands of the training continued to favor Marcus's natural advantages. During hand-to-hand combat sessions, his size and strength made him nearly unbeatable against the other candidates. His performance in strength-based challenges was consistently superior, and his confidence grew with each passing day. He began to feel certain that he was destined to be not just among the graduates of the program, but the top graduate. It was during a particularly intense training week that Marcus first began to notice the small inconsistencies that would eventually shatter his understanding of everything he thought he knew about strength and capability. The candidates were undergoing advanced weapons training, learning to operate sophisticated systems that required both technical knowledge and physical skill. Marcus excelled at the physical aspects of the training, but he struggled with some of the more complex technical components. He was having difficulty with the advanced targeting systems when Sergeant Chun approached his training station. "Corporal Thompson," she said quietly, "you're fighting the recoil compensation system instead of working with it. Try adjusting your grip pressure and breathing rhythm." She demonstrated the proper technique with movements that were precise and controlled, and Marcus was surprised to see that her handling of the weapon system was flawless. "Have you used this system before?" Marcus asked, genuinely curious about how someone in a support role would have gained such specific expertise. Sergeant Chun's expression remained neutral. "I've had some experience with various weapon systems," she replied simply. "The principles are consistent across most platforms." But Marcus noticed that her demonstration had been far more sophisticated than basic familiarity would suggest. Later that evening, Marcus found himself talking with Jake Wilson and Amanda Foster about their observations during training. "Did you notice how Sergeant Chun handled that targeting system today?" he asked. "She knew it better than some of our instructors." Amanda nodded thoughtfully. "I've been wondering about that, too. She seems to know a lot about field operations for someone in administration." Jake looked around to make sure they weren't being overheard. I heard Master Sergeant Rodriguez talking to Captain Morrison about getting her input on the mountain. Warfare scenarios. Why would they ask an admin clerk about tactical planning? The three candidates exchanged glances, each recognizing that there were aspects of their training environment that didn't quite make sense. Marcus decided to pay closer attention to Sergeant Chen's interactions with the senior training staff. Over the next several days, he observed patterns that seemed increasingly inconsistent with her apparent role. During briefings, he noticed that Colonel Hayes would sometimes defer to Sergeant Chun's expertise on technical matters. When complex, tactical scenarios were being discussed, several instructors would glance in her direction as if seeking approval or confirmation. The mystery deepened when Marcus overheard a conversation between two visiting instructors from another base. They were discussing the training program at Fort Blackwater, and one of them mentioned that the tactical innovations being implemented were exactly the kind of thinking that made Phoenix legendary. The other instructor nodded and said, "Too bad she's not available for active operations anymore. The community could use that kind of expertise." Marcus didn't recognize the code name Phoenix, but something about the way it was spoken suggested it referred to someone of considerable importance in the special operations community. He made a mental note to research the name when he had access to a computer, but the demanding training schedule left little time for investigation. The physical challenges continued to favor Marcus's natural advantages, but he began to notice that the most successful candidates were those who demonstrated tactical intelligence rather than just physical prowess. During complex scenario exercises, candidates who could think strategically and adapt to changing conditions performed better than those who relied solely on strength and aggression. This shift in evaluation criteria began to concern Marcus. He had always succeeded by being the strongest and most physically capable person in any group, but the training at Fort Blackwater seemed to value different qualities. Intelligence, adaptability, and strategic thinking were being weighted more heavily than he had expected, and he found himself struggling to maintain his position as the top candidate. It was during a particularly challenging urban warfare exercise that Marcus first witnessed something that would fundamentally change his understanding of what he had been observing. The candidates were required to navigate through a complex scenario involving hostage rescue, and Marcus's team had become trapped in a building with no apparent exit routes. The exercise was designed to test problem-solving under pressure, and Marcus found himself at a complete loss. Sergeant Chun appeared at the edge of the exercise area, ostensibly to monitor equipment usage, but Marcus noticed that she seemed to be observing the tactical situation with unusual intensity. When his team's communications failed, and they were unable to coordinate with the exercise controllers, she quietly approached Master Sergeant Rodriguez and whispered something in his ear. Within minutes, the exercise parameters were modified in a way that provided Marcus's team with new options for completing their mission. The changes were subtle and appeared to be part of the original scenario design, but Marcus recognized that they had been implemented in response to his team's specific tactical situation. It was as if someone with extensive tactical expertise had analyzed their problem and provided exactly the kind of guidance that would allow them to succeed. After the exercise, Marcus approached Sergeant Chun with the pretense of discussing equipment issues. "That was an interesting scenario modification," he said, hoping to draw her into conversation about the tactical aspects of the exercise. "The timing seemed perfectly calibrated to test our adaptability." Sergeant Chun's expression remained neutral, but Marcus thought he detected a flicker of something that might have been satisfaction at his observation. "Training scenarios are designed to evolve based on candidate performance," she replied. "The goal is to create learning opportunities rather than simply testing existing skills." But Marcus noticed that her explanation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of training methodology that seemed inconsistent with her apparent role. As the weeks passed, Marcus found himself increasingly intrigued by the contradictions he observed in Sergeant Chun's position at Fort Blackwater. Her knowledge was clearly extensive. Her expertise was obviously valued by the senior training staff, and her influence on the training program seemed far greater than her visible rank would suggest. But every time he tried to understand more about her background or role, he encountered the same quiet professionalism that revealed nothing about her history or qualifications. The physical demands of the training continued to challenge all the candidates, but Marcus began to notice that success in the program required more than just physical capability. The most successful candidates were those who demonstrated mental resilience, tactical creativity, and the ability to perform under extreme psychological pressure. These were qualities that Marcus had never been forced to develop, and he found himself struggling to adapt to evaluation criteria that didn't favor his natural advantages. It was during a mountain survival exercise that Marcus first began to understand the true nature of what he was experiencing at Fort Blackwater. The candidates were required to survive for 72 hours in harsh winter conditions with minimal equipment, and Marcus's team had become lost in a blizzard that had developed unexpectedly. The situation was becoming dangerous, and Marcus realized that his physical strength was useless against the kind of environmental challenges they were facing. When rescue teams arrived to extract the candidates, Marcus noticed that the operation was coordinated with a level of precision that suggested extensive expertise in mountain rescue operations. The team leader moved through the difficult terrain with remarkable efficiency, and the extraction was executed flawlessly despite the challenging conditions. It was only when they reached the base camp that Marcus realized the rescue operation had been coordinated by Sergeant Chun. The debriefing session that followed the survival exercise provided Marcus with new insights into the complexity of the training program. Colonel Hayes discussed the various factors that had contributed to the success or failure of different candidate teams, and her analysis demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of how environmental factors, psychological pressure, and tactical decision-making interacted to determine outcomes. But what struck Marcus most was the way Colonel Hayes deferred to Sergeant Chun's expertise during the technical aspects of the debriefing. When discussing the mountain rescue protocols, the colonel explicitly asked for Sergeant Chun's input on procedural modifications that might improve future training exercises. The conversation that followed revealed a level of expertise that was clearly based on extensive field experience in mountain operations. Marcus left the debriefing session with more questions than answers. Everything he observed suggested that Sergeant Chun possessed expertise and experience that far exceeded what would be expected from someone in a support role. But he couldn't reconcile this with her apparent position in the military hierarchy. The contradictions were becoming impossible to ignore, and Marcus found himself determined to understand what he was really observing. The next phase of training would take the candidates into even more challenging scenarios, testing their limits in ways that would reveal the true nature of their capabilities. Marcus was confident in his physical abilities, but he was beginning to understand that success at Fort Blackwater required qualities that couldn't be measured in terms of strength or speed. The real test was still ahead, and Marcus was about to discover that his assumptions about strength, capability, and military excellence were completely wrong. The morning briefing room at Fort Blackwater buzzed with the low murmur of conversation as the 30 elite candidates settled into their seats. Marcus Thompson claimed a position in the third row, close enough to demonstrate his engagement, but far enough back to observe the entire room. His eyes swept across the assembly of training personnel, cataloging each instructor's obvious qualifications and impressive credentials. These were the warriors who would forge him into something even more formidable than he already was. Colonel Hayes entered with her characteristic brisk efficiency, followed by the senior training staff. Behind them, almost as an afterthought, came Sergeant Chun carrying a thick folder of training documents. She moved to a small desk positioned along the side wall, where she began organizing papers with the methodical precision of someone whose job was to keep track of details while others handled the important work. Marcus watched as she arranged her materials, noting how she seemed to fade into the background despite being in full view of everyone present. Her olive drab uniform was perfectly pressed but unremarkable. Her posture was professional but not commanding, and her entire presence suggested someone who had found her appropriate level in the military hierarchy. She was clearly competent at her administrative duties, but there was nothing about her that suggested she belonged in the same conversation as the battle-hardened instructors who commanded the room. Today we begin your introduction to advanced tactical operations, Colonel Hayes announced, her voice cutting through the ambient noise. You will learn that elite military operations require more than individual excellence. They require the ability to function as a seamless unit under conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. She gestured toward the senior instructors. These men and women have commanded operations in every major conflict of the past 2 decades. Their knowledge will be your foundation. As Colonel Hayes continued her presentation, Marcus noticed that Sergeant Chun had positioned herself where she could observe both the candidates and the instructors simultaneously. Her eyes moved constantly, but her attention seemed divided between taking notes and conducting some kind of assessment that Marcus couldn't quite identify. Occasionally, she would make a brief notation on a separate piece of paper, as if she were tracking something that wasn't part of the official record. The first instructor to present was Master Sergeant Rodriguez, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was legendary throughout the special operations community. His presentation on small unit tactics was masterful, combining theoretical knowledge with practical examples drawn from actual combat operations. Marcus found himself completely absorbed in the material, recognizing that he was learning from someone whose expertise had been tested in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. But halfway through Rodriguez's presentation, Marcus noticed something that struck him as unusual. The Master Sergeant was discussing a complex urban warfare scenario when he paused mid-sentence and glanced toward the side of the room where Sergeant Chun was sitting. The glance was brief and might have been meaningless, but Marcus caught a subtle nod that passed between them. Rodriguez immediately adjusted his presentation, adding details about an alternative tactical approach that he hadn't originally planned to cover. The modification was seamless and enhanced the educational value of the presentation. But Marcus was puzzled by the apparent communication between the senior instructor and the administrative clerk. It was as if Rodriguez had been seeking approval or confirmation before proceeding with certain aspects of his material, which would be completely inappropriate given their respective positions in the military hierarchy. Captain Morrison's presentation on advanced marksmanship techniques was equally impressive, but Marcus observed similar patterns of subtle communication between the instructor and Sergeant Chen when Morrison was demonstrating complex shooting positions. He would occasionally glance in her direction as if seeking confirmation that his explanations were technically accurate. These interactions were so brief and subtle that Marcus doubted anyone else in the room had noticed them, but they were beginning to form a pattern that he couldn't ignore. The presentations continued throughout the morning, each one delivered by an instructor whose credentials were impeccable and whose expertise was obvious. But Marcus found himself paying increasing attention to the subtle dynamics between the training staff and Sergeant Chun. There was a level of deference in their interactions that seemed completely inconsistent with her apparent role as a support staff member. During the lunch break, Marcus decided to investigate his observations more systematically. He positioned himself near the instructor's table in the mess hall, hoping to overhear conversations that might provide insight into the unusual dynamics he had witnessed. The discussion among the senior staff was focused on training methodology and candidate evaluation, but Marcus noticed that they frequently referenced opinions and recommendations that weren't attributed to any specific individual. The night navigation exercise needs to be modified, Captain Morrison was saying to Master Sergeant Rodriguez. The current route doesn't adequately test the candidate's ability to adapt to unexpected terrain changes. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. I agree, but I'd like to get input on the specific modifications before we implement them. Her recommendations for the last scenario proved invaluable. Marcus strained to hear more of the conversation, but the instructors lowered their voices as other personnel moved through the mess hall. The reference to Zaya recommendations was intriguing, but Marcus couldn't determine who they were discussing. The conversation suggested that someone was providing tactical input to the senior training staff, but the identity of that person remained unclear. After lunch, the candidates were divided into smaller groups for hands-on training exercises. Marcus found himself assigned to a group that would be working with advanced communication equipment, and he was surprised to discover that their instructor would be Sergeant Chun. The other candidates in his group seemed equally puzzled by the assignment, as they had expected to be working with one of the senior combat instructors. This equipment represents the most advanced communication technology available to Special Operations Forces. Sergeant Chun began, her voice carrying the same quiet authority she displayed in administrative settings. Your ability to master these systems could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She moved to a table covered with sophisticated radio equipment that Marcus had never seen before. What followed was the most comprehensive technical briefing Marcus had ever experienced. Sergeant Chun demonstrated not just the basic operation of the communication systems, but their integration with other tactical technologies, their vulnerabilities under various environmental conditions, and their adaptation for specialized mission requirements. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, and her explanations were clearly based on extensive field experience. Marcus found himself struggling to keep up with the technical complexity of the material. The communication systems were far more sophisticated than anything he had encountered during his previous training, and their proper operation required an understanding of electronic warfare principles that went far beyond his current knowledge base. Several times during the briefing, he had to ask for clarification on concepts that Sergeant Chun presented as fundamental knowledge. The frequency hopping algorithm is designed to prevent enemy interception, she explained in response to one of Marcus's questions. But it can be compromised if the enemy has access to certain types of electronic intelligence. In hostile environments, you need to assume that your communications are being monitored and plan accordingly. Her explanation revealed a sophisticated understanding of both the technical and operational aspects of secure communications. What struck Marcus most was the way Sergeant Chun handled the equipment itself. Her movements were precise and economical, suggesting years of practice with these systems. When she demonstrated rapid frequency changes under simulated combat conditions, her actions were smooth and automatic, clearly based on muscle memory developed through extensive use. This was not the kind of familiarity that came from reading technical manuals or attending training courses. Private Jake Wilson, who was also in Marcus's group, raised his hand during the briefing. Sergeant Chun, this equipment configuration looks like it's designed for deep reconnaissance operations. Have you worked with these systems in operational environments? The question was asked with genuine curiosity, but Marcus noticed that Sergeant Chun's expression became slightly guarded. I've had experience with various communication systems. In different contexts, she replied carefully. The principles remain consistent regardless of the specific operational environment. But Marcus observed that her response was deliberately vague, avoiding any specific details about her background or experience. The hands-on portion of the training proved even more revealing. As the candidates worked with the communication equipment, Sergeant Chun moved among them, providing individual instruction and correcting technical errors. Her feedback was precise and practical, addressing not just the mechanical aspects of equipment operation, but the tactical considerations that would affect their use in actual combat situations. Marcus was having difficulty with the encryption protocols when Sergeant Chun approached his workstation. "You're trying to memorize the sequences instead of understanding the underlying logic," she observed. "In combat, you won't have time to think through each step. The process needs to become instinctive." She demonstrated the proper technique with movements that were so fluid and natural that Marcus realized she must have performed these operations thousands of times. "How long did it take you to develop that level of proficiency?" Marcus asked, genuinely impressed by her skill. Sergeant Chun paused for a moment, as if considering how to answer. "Proficiency comes with practice and necessity," she replied. "When your life depends on getting it right, you learn quickly." The response suggested experience in situations where communication failures could have life or death consequences. As the afternoon training session continued, Marcus observed that Sergeant Chun's interactions with the candidates revealed layers of knowledge that extended far beyond technical expertise. When Private Amanda Foster asked about adapting communication procedures for mountain warfare, Sergeant Chun's response included detailed information about altitude effects on radio propagation, terrain masking considerations, and weather-related interference patterns. Her knowledge was clearly based on practical experience rather than theoretical study. The session concluded with a simulated communication exercise that required the candidates to maintain contact while navigating through various interference scenarios. Marcus found the exercise challenging, but he was amazed by Sergeant Chun's ability to monitor multiple communication channels simultaneously while providing real-time feedback on each candidate's performance. Her situational awareness was extraordinary, and her ability to process complex information streams was unlike anything Marcus had encountered. After the training session, Marcus lingered in the equipment room, ostensibly to review the technical manuals but actually hoping to observe Sergeant Chen's post-training procedures. He watched as she systematically inspected each piece of equipment, making detailed notes about its condition and performance during the exercise. Her inspection was thorough and professional, but Marcus noticed that she paid particular attention to certain components that hadn't been covered in the training materials. The atmospheric conditions today created some interesting propagation anomalies, she commented, apparently to herself, as she examined one of the radio units. The candidates performed better than expected given the interference levels. Her observation suggested that she had been monitoring environmental factors that would affect equipment performance, which was far beyond the scope of routine training oversight. Marcus decided to engage her in conversation. "That was an impressive training session," he said, approaching her workstation. "Your knowledge of these systems is remarkable. Did you specialize in communications during your military training?" Sergeant Chun looked up from her equipment inspection, her expression neutral but alert. "I've worked with various military technologies over the years," she replied. "Communication systems are fundamental to military operations, so it's important to understand their capabilities and limitations." Her answer was professionally appropriate, but revealed nothing about her specific background or training. Marcus pressed further. "The way you handled the equipment suggested extensive field experience. Have you deployed with units that use these systems operationally?" Sergeant Chun's inspection of the radio equipment became more focused, as if she were using the task to avoid direct eye contact during the conversation. "I've been fortunate to work with experienced personnel who shared their knowledge," she said carefully. "Military technology is constantly evolving, so continuous learning is essential." Marcus recognized that she was deflecting his questions without being overtly evasive, but her responses only increased his curiosity about her background. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who entered the equipment room with a clipboard and a purposeful expression. "Sergeant Chun, I need to discuss the modifications to tomorrow's navigation exercise," he said. "The terrain conditions have changed since we designed the original route." Marcus noticed that Rodriguez's tone was respectful and deferential, as if he were consulting with someone whose expertise he valued highly. I reviewed the weather reports and satellite imagery this morning, Sergeant Chun replied, pulling a folder from her desk. The snowfall has created some avalanche risks in the eastern approaches, but there are alternative routes that would provide equivalent training value. She opened the folder to reveal detailed topographic maps covered with annotations and route modifications. Marcus was amazed by the sophistication of the route analysis. The maps showed not just alternative paths through the mountain terrain, but detailed assessments of weather-related hazards, visibility conditions, and strategic considerations that would affect the training exercise. The annotations were clearly the work of someone with extensive experience in mountain warfare and tactical planning. These modifications look excellent, Rodriguez said after reviewing the maps. The new route will actually provide better training opportunities than the original plan. He paused and glanced at Marcus, who was still present in the equipment room. Sergeant Chun has an exceptional ability to analyze complex tactical situations and develop innovative solutions. The comment was clearly intended to explain the unusual level of consultation between the senior instructor and the administrative sergeant. But Marcus found it only raised more questions. The route analysis demonstrated expertise that would be expected from a senior tactical planner, not from someone in a support role. The level of detail and strategic thinking required for such work suggested training and experience that went far beyond routine administrative duties. After Rodriguez left with the modified route plans, Marcus attempted to continue his conversation with Sergeant Chun. "That was impressive route analysis," he said. "Do you have specialized training in tactical planning?" Sergeant Chun had returned to her equipment inspection, but Marcus noticed that her movements had become more deliberate, as if she were concentrating on maintaining a professional facade. Military operations require coordination between many different specialties, she replied without looking up from her work. Understanding how different factors interact is important for supporting mission success. Her response was technically accurate, but revealed nothing about her specific qualifications or training background. Marcus was beginning to recognize a pattern in Sergeant Chun's responses to his questions. She was consistently professional and helpful, but she carefully avoided providing any specific information about her background, training, or experience. Her deflections were subtle and skillful, maintaining the appearance of openness while actually revealing nothing of substance about her qualifications. The following morning brought a new set of training challenges designed to test the candidates' ability to operate under extreme physical and psychological pressure. Marcus excelled at the physical components, but he found himself struggling with the complex decision-making scenarios that required rapid analysis of multiple variables. Training was designed to simulate the kind of high-stress situations that special operations personnel would encounter in actual combat. During a particularly challenging scenario involving simulated hostage rescue, Marcus's team became trapped in a tactical situation that seemed to have no viable solution. The exercise parameters required them to achieve multiple objectives simultaneously, while operating under severe time constraints and with limited resources. Marcus found himself paralyzed by the complexity of the situation, unable to identify a course of action that would lead to mission success. It was during this crisis that Marcus observed something that fundamentally changed his understanding of what was happening at Fort Blackwater. As his team struggled with the impossible tactical problem, he noticed that Master Sergeant Rodriguez was quietly consulting with Sergeant Chun at the edge of the exercise area. Their conversation was brief and discreet, but Marcus saw Rodriguez nodding as if he were receiving important guidance. Within minutes of their conversation, the exercise parameters were modified in subtle ways that provided Marcus's team with new tactical options. The changes appeared to be part of the original scenario design, but Marcus recognized that they had been implemented in response to his team's specific predicament. Someone had analyzed their tactical situation and provided exactly the kind of guidance that would allow them to succeed. The modification was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of providing direct assistance, it created new opportunities for the team to demonstrate their problem-solving abilities. The tactical situation remained challenging, but it was no longer impossible. Marcus realized that whoever had designed the modification possessed an exceptional understanding of both tactical operations and training methodology. As his team worked through the modified scenario, Marcus found himself thinking about the brief conversation he had witnessed between Rodriguez and Sergeant Chun. The timing of their consultation and the subsequent changes to the exercise parameters suggested that she had been the source of the tactical guidance. But such expertise would be completely inconsistent with her apparent role as administrative support. The exercise concluded successfully, and Marcus's team was debriefed on their performance. The feedback was detailed and constructive, focusing on the decision-making processes that had led to their eventual success. But Marcus found himself less interested in the official evaluation than in understanding the behind-the-scenes dynamics that had influenced the exercise. Later that evening, Marcus decided to conduct his own investigation into Sergeant Chun's background and qualifications. He had access to basic personnel databases through the training facility's computer system, and he hoped to find information that would explain the contradictions he had been observing. What he discovered only deepened the mystery. According to the official records, Sergeant Chun had been assigned to Fort Blackwater 18 months earlier in an administrative capacity. Her previous assignments were listed as various support roles at different military installations, and her specialty code indicated training in logistics and administration. There was nothing in her official record that would explain the technical expertise and tactical knowledge she had demonstrated. But Marcus noticed gaps in the record that suggested information was being withheld. Certain periods of service were listed with minimal detail, and her training history included several entries that were marked as classified. The overall picture was of someone whose official record told only part of the story, leaving significant questions about her actual background and qualifications. As Marcus reviewed the limited information available, he realized that his investigation had revealed more questions than answers. Everything he had observed suggested that Sergeant Chen possessed expertise and experience that far exceeded what would be expected from someone in her official position. But the official records provided no explanation for the contradictions he had witnessed. The mystery of Sergeant Chun was becoming an obsession for Marcus. Every interaction he observed, every demonstration of unexpected expertise, every subtle indication of deference from senior personnel, added to his growing conviction that there was much more to her story than met the eye. He was determined to understand what he was really seeing, but the truth remained frustratingly out of reach. The next phase of training would involve even more complex challenges that would test the candidates' limits in ways they couldn't yet imagine. Marcus was confident in his physical abilities, but he was beginning to understand that success at Fort Blackwater required qualities that couldn't be measured in traditional terms. The real test was still ahead, and the contradictions surrounding Sergeant Chun were about to become impossible to ignore. The mountain air bit through Marcus's tactical gear as he crouched behind a boulder, his breath forming small clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. The advanced reconnaissance exercise had been running for 14 hours, and his team was exhausted from navigating the treacherous terrain of the Colorado Rockies. What had started as a routine training mission had evolved into something far more complex, testing not just their physical endurance, but their ability to adapt to constantly changing tactical situations. Marcus adjusted his night vision goggles and scanned the valley below, searching for signs of the opposing force that had been hunting his team since midnight. The exercise scenario required them to gather intelligence on enemy positions while avoiding detection, but every time they thought they had gained an advantage, the parameters seemed to shift in ways that created new challenges. It was as if someone was orchestrating the exercise with an intimate understanding of how to push the candidates to their absolute limits. The radio crackled softly in his ear as Jake Wilson reported from his overwatch position. Movement in Sector 7, approximately 800 meters southeast of your position. Looks like a patrol moving toward the bridge checkpoint. Marcus acknowledged the report and began calculating tactical options. The bridge was a critical waypoint in their mission, but approaching it with enemy forces in the area would require careful planning. As Marcus studied the terrain through his scope, he noticed something that made him pause. The patrol movements seemed almost choreographed, as if they were designed to create specific tactical challenges rather than following realistic enemy behavior patterns. The timing was too precise, the positioning too deliberate. Someone with exceptional tactical knowledge was controlling the exercise, making real-time adjustments based on the candidate's performance. The realization prompted Marcus to think about the exercise design process. Who at Fort Blackwater possessed the expertise to create such sophisticated training scenarios? The senior instructors were certainly qualified, but the level of tactical innovation he was witnessing suggested someone with extraordinary field experience. As he considered the possibilities, his thoughts inevitably returned to the mystery surrounding Sergeant Chun. Over the past several weeks, Marcus had become increasingly obsessed with understanding her true role at the facility. Every observation added to his growing conviction that she was far more than she appeared to be. The technical expertise she had demonstrated, the deference shown by senior instructors, and the sophisticated tactical thinking evident in the training exercises all pointed to someone with capabilities that extended far beyond administrative support. The exercise continued through the morning hours, presenting the candidates with a series of challenges that required innovative problem-solving and flawless execution. Marcus found himself impressed by the complexity of the scenarios, but also frustrated by their apparent impossibility. Each time his team developed a solution to one tactical problem, new complications would emerge that forced them to completely reconsider their approach. It was during a particularly difficult phase of the exercise that Marcus witnessed something that would fundamentally change his understanding of what was happening at Fort Blackwater. His team had been pinned down by simulated enemy fire when he noticed a figure moving through the tree line approximately 500 meters from their position. The person was using advanced movement techniques that indicated extensive training in reconnaissance and infiltration. Through his binoculars, Marcus was amazed to see that the figure was Sergeant Chun. She was dressed in full tactical gear and moving with a level of skill that rivaled the most experienced special operations personnel Marcus had ever observed. Her movements were fluid and economical, taking advantage of every piece of available cover while maintaining perfect situational awareness. This was not the movement pattern of someone whose primary experience was in administrative support. Marcus watched in fascination as Sergeant Chen conducted what appeared to be a detailed assessment of the tactical situation. She observed the candidates' positions, analyzed their decision-making processes, and seemed to be evaluating their performance against some internal standard. Her behavior suggested that she was not simply monitoring the exercise, but actively controlling its evolution. The confirmation came when Marcus observed Sergeant Chun communicating with the exercise control team through a secure radio system. Her instructions were brief and precise, but Marcus could see that they resulted in immediate changes to the exercise parameters. Enemy positions were adjusted, time constraints were modified, and new tactical opportunities were created that allowed the candidates to demonstrate their problem-solving abilities. The sophistication of the tactical adjustments was extraordinary. Instead of making the exercise easier, the modifications created new challenges that required the candidates to think creatively and adapt quickly to changing circumstances. Person controlling these changes possessed an exceptional understanding of both tactical operations and training methodology. Marcus realized that he was witnessing the work of someone whose expertise was truly exceptional. As the exercise continued, Marcus found himself paying more attention to Sergeant Chun's actions than to his own team's tactical situation. Her movement through the difficult terrain was flawless, demonstrating skills that would be expected from elite reconnaissance specialists. When she needed to observe the candidates from elevated positions, she scaled rocky outcroppings with the confidence of someone who had extensive experience in mountain warfare. The exercise concluded in the early afternoon with a complex scenario that required multiple teams to coordinate their actions while operating under severe time constraints. Marcus's team performed well, but he was more interested in understanding how the exercise had been designed and controlled. The level of tactical sophistication he had witnessed suggested that someone with extraordinary qualifications was responsible for the training program's advanced scenarios. During the post-exercise debriefing, Marcus observed the interactions between the instructors and candidates with new understanding. The feedback provided by Master Sergeant Rodriguez and Captain Morrison was detailed and insightful, but Marcus recognized that their analysis was based on observations and evaluations that had been coordinated by someone else. The real tactical expertise was coming from a source that remained hidden from the candidates. Colonel Hayes concluded the debriefing with comments about the exercise's training value and the candidates' overall performance. Today's exercise demonstrated the kind of tactical thinking and adaptability that will be required in actual operations, she said. The scenarios you encountered were designed to test your ability to function under extreme pressure while maintaining tactical effectiveness. Your performance indicates that you are developing the skills necessary for special operations success. But Marcus noticed that Colonel Hayes glanced toward the back of the room as she spoke, as if seeking confirmation from someone whose opinion she valued. Sergeant Chun was present, as always, organizing paperwork and maintaining her usual low profile. But Marcus now understood that her presence was far more significant than it appeared. After the debriefing, Marcus decided to conduct a more systematic investigation into Sergeant Chun's background and qualifications. He had access to various military databases through the training facility's computer systems, and he hoped to find information that would explain the extraordinary capabilities he had witnessed. What he discovered during his research only deepened the mystery surrounding her true identity. The official personnel records showed that Sergeant Chun had been assigned to Fort Blackwater in an administrative capacity, but Marcus noticed significant gaps in her service history. Certain periods of her military career were marked as classified, with no details provided about her assignments or training. The overall picture was of someone whose official record told only a small part of her actual story. Marcus found references to specialized training courses that were far beyond what would be expected for someone in an administrative role. The records indicated that she had completed advanced tactical training, specialized communication courses, and mountain warfare instruction. These qualifications suggested military experience that extended far beyond routine support duties. The most intriguing discovery was a series of commendations and awards that seemed inconsistent with her current position. Marcus found references to exceptional performance evaluations and recognition for outstanding service, but the specific details were classified at levels that required security clearances he didn't possess. The pattern suggested that Sergeant Chun had distinguished herself in ways that remained hidden from routine personnel inquiries. As Marcus continued his research, he began to piece together fragments of information that suggested a much more complex background than Sergeant Chun's current role would indicate. There were references to deployments in classified locations, participation in joint operations with other military branches, and training with specialized units whose missions were highly classified. The cumulative evidence painted a picture of someone whose military experience was extraordinary. The investigation was interrupted when Marcus realized that his computer access was being monitored. A security alert appeared on his screen, indicating that his database queries had been flagged for administrative review. The message was routine, but Marcus understood that his attempts to research Sergeant Chian's background had been detected by the facility's security systems. Within an hour of the security alert, Marcus received instructions to report to Master Sergeant Rodriguez's office. The summons was presented as routine administrative business, but Marcus suspected that his research activities had prompted the meeting. He approached Rodriguez's office with some apprehension, uncertain about how his investigation might be perceived by the senior training staff. Master Sergeant Rodriguez was reviewing training reports when Marcus entered the office. His expression was professional but serious, and Marcus immediately sensed that the meeting would address his recent computer activities. Rodriguez gestured for him to take a seat and continued his review for several minutes before speaking. "Corporal Thompson, I understand you've been conducting research into personnel records and training histories," Rodriguez said, his tone neutral but direct. "Is there something specific you're trying to understand about the training program or facility operations?" The question was phrased diplomatically, but Marcus recognized that his investigation had been discovered and was being addressed. Marcus considered his response carefully. He could deny the research or claim it was motivated by general curiosity, but he sensed that Rodriguez already knew the specifics of his database queries. Instead, he decided to be honest about his observations and concerns. "Master Sergeant, I've been trying to understand some inconsistencies I've observed in the training program," Marcus replied. "There seem to be aspects of the tactical instruction and exercise design that suggest expertise beyond what would be expected from the official training staff." He paused, uncertain about how much of his suspicions to reveal. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair and studied Marcus for a long moment. His expression suggested that he was weighing his response carefully, as if deciding how much information to share. "What kind of inconsistencies are you referring to?" he asked. Marcus chose his words carefully. "The tactical scenarios we've been experiencing show a level of sophistication that suggests someone with exceptional field experience is designing them. The exercise modifications happen in real time based on our performance, which requires extraordinary tactical knowledge and training methodology expertise." Rodriguez nodded slowly, as if Marcus's observations were confirming something he had expected. "Military training programs often involve personnel with diverse backgrounds and experience levels," he said. "The goal is to provide the best possible instruction using all available resources." The response was professionally appropriate, but revealed nothing about the specific personnel involved in the training program. Marcus recognized that Rodriguez was being deliberately vague, neither confirming nor denying his suspicions about Sergeant Chun's role in the tactical instruction. "I've also noticed that some of the technical instruction we've received demonstrates expertise that seems inconsistent with certain personnel's official positions," Marcus continued, deciding to be more direct about his observations. "The level of knowledge being demonstrated suggests experience that goes far beyond routine administrative duties." Rodriguez's expression became more guarded, and Marcus sensed that he was approaching sensitive information. "Military personnel often have backgrounds that aren't immediately apparent from their current assignments," Rodriguez said carefully. "The Army values diverse experience and uses personnel skills in ways that best serve the mission." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Marcus realized that he wasn't going to obtain the specific information he was seeking. Rodriguez was clearly aware of his interest in Sergeant Chun's background, but he was not going to provide any details about her qualifications or previous assignments. The meeting concluded with general guidance about focusing on his own training rather than investigating other personnel. As Marcus left Rodriguez's office, he understood that his investigation had reached a dead end. The official channels were not going to provide the information he was seeking, and continuing to pursue the matter through computer databases would likely result in more serious consequences. But his curiosity about Sergeant Chun's true identity had only been intensified by the obvious reluctance to discuss her background. That evening, Marcus decided to take a different approach to his investigation. Instead of relying on official records, he would observe Sergeant Chen's activities more systematically and try to understand her role through direct observation. He positioned himself in locations where he could watch her interactions with other personnel and try to identify patterns that might reveal her true function at Fort Blackwater. What Marcus discovered during his surveillance was even more intriguing than his earlier observations. Sergeant Chen's daily activities extended far beyond routine administrative duties. She spent considerable time in areas of the facility that were restricted to senior personnel, and she participated in planning meetings that should have been limited to tactical instructors and command staff. Marcus observed her entering the secure planning facility where exercise scenarios were developed and modified. Her presence in this restricted area suggested that she had security clearances and responsibilities that were inconsistent with her apparent administrative role. The duration of her meetings in the planning facility indicated that she was actively involved in designing the training exercises rather than simply supporting their implementation. The most revealing observation came when Marcus witnessed Sergeant Chen leading a briefing for the senior instructors. Through a partially open door, he could see her presenting detailed tactical analysis and recommending modifications to upcoming training scenarios. The instructors were listening attentively and asking technical questions that suggested they valued her expertise highly. The briefing Marcus observed was unlike anything he had expected. Sergeant Chen's presentation was sophisticated and detailed, covering tactical considerations that would be expected from someone with extensive field experience. Her recommendations were specific and practical, addressing both the educational objectives of the training and the safety considerations involved in conducting realistic exercises. The deference shown by the senior instructors was unmistakable. These were experienced combat veterans whose expertise was unquestionable, yet they were clearly seeking and valuing Sergeant Chen's input on tactical matters. The dynamic suggested that she possessed knowledge and experience that commanded respect from personnel whose credentials were impeccable. Marcus's investigation was revealing a picture of someone whose true role at Fort Blackwater was far more significant than her official position suggested. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling, indicating that Sergeant Chen was not simply an administrative support person, but someone whose expertise was central to the facility's training mission. The mystery was becoming more complex rather than clearer. Every observation added to Marcus's conviction that Sergeant Chen was extraordinary, but the specific nature of her background and qualifications remained hidden. Her ability to maintain her cover while operating at such a high level suggested training and experience in operational security that went far beyond routine military service. As Marcus continued his surveillance, he realized that he was witnessing the work of someone whose skills and knowledge were truly exceptional. The question was not whether Sergeant Chen was more than she appeared to be, but rather how much more. The answer to that question would prove to be far more extraordinary than Marcus could have imagined. The following week brought new training challenges that would test the candidates' abilities in ways they had not yet experienced. Marcus approached these exercises with renewed attention to the tactical sophistication and training methodology involved. He was determined to understand the true source of the exceptional instruction they were receiving, even if official channels would not provide the answers he was seeking. The Advanced Wilderness Survival exercise began before dawn on a Monday morning that promised to be one of the most challenging yet. Marcus and his fellow candidates were transported to a remote area of the Rocky Mountains where they would be required to survive for 5 days, using only basic equipment and their own skills. The scenario was designed to test their ability to function under extreme environmental stress while maintaining tactical effectiveness. What Marcus didn't know was that the exercise would provide him with the most revealing insights, yet into Sergeant Chen's true capabilities and background. The Wilderness Survival Challenge would push all the candidates to their limits, But it would also create conditions that would make it impossible for Sergeant Chun to maintain her carefully constructed cover identity. The truth about who she really was would soon become impossible to hide. The blizzard struck without warning on the third night of the wilderness survival exercise, transforming what had been a challenging but manageable training scenario into a life-threatening emergency. Marcus huddled in his hastily constructed shelter as hurricane-force winds howled through the mountain passes, bringing with them temperatures that plunged to nearly 30 degrees below zero. The storm had come out of nowhere, catching all 8 candidates in his training group exposed on a high ridge with minimal protection from the elements. Marcus's radio crackled with desperate transmissions from his fellow candidates scattered across the mountainside. Jake Wilson's voice was barely audible through the static and wind noise as he reported that his shelter had been destroyed by the wind and he was suffering from severe hypothermia. Amanda Foster was trapped in a ravine where she had sought shelter, unable to move due to what sounded like a serious leg injury. The other candidates were reporting similar emergencies, and it was becoming clear that the exercise had evolved into a genuine survival situation. The exercise control team had been maintaining radio contact throughout the first 2 days, but their communications had gone silent when the storm hit. Marcus assumed that the severe weather was interfering with their radio systems, but he was beginning to worry that the situation was beyond the capability of the normal safety protocols. The candidates were spread across several square miles of treacherous mountain terrain. Visibility was near zero, and the weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Marcus tried repeatedly to establish contact with the base, but his radio produced only static and interference. The storm was creating electromagnetic disturbances that made communication impossible, and he realized that he and his fellow candidates were completely isolated. The backup communication systems they had been trained to use were equally affected by the weather conditions, leaving them without any means of calling for help. As the night wore on, the radio transmissions from the other candidates became increasingly desperate. Private Brooks reported that he had lost most of his survival gear when his pack was blown off a cliff by the wind. 2 other candidates had become separated from their equipment and were facing exposure with no protection from the elements. The situation was rapidly becoming critical, and Marcus realized that without immediate rescue, some of his fellow candidates might not survive the night. The wind reached a crescendo around midnight, with gusts that Marcus estimated at over 80 miles per hour. The sound was deafening, and he could feel his shelter being tested to its limits by the tremendous forces acting on it. Ice crystals, driven by the wind, felt like needles against any exposed skin, and Marcus knew that venturing outside in these conditions would be suicide. But the radio reports from his fellow candidates indicated that several of them were in immediate danger of dying from exposure. It was during the worst of the storm that Marcus heard something that made him question his understanding of the entire situation. Through the howling wind and radio static, he caught fragments of a transmission that seemed to be coming from someone conducting a professional rescue operation. The voice was calm and controlled, providing precise instructions for emergency medical procedures and coordinating what sounded like a complex evacuation operation. Marcus strained to hear more of the transmission, but the interference made it impossible to understand most of the communication. What he could discern suggested that someone was actively managing a rescue operation with a level of expertise that indicated extensive experience in emergency response. The voice was providing guidance on treating hypothermia, coordinating helicopter operations in extreme weather, and managing multiple casualty evacuations simultaneously. The transmission faded in and out, but Marcus caught enough fragments to understand that a highly skilled professional was coordinating the rescue effort. The tactical communication protocols being used were sophisticated and efficient, suggesting someone with extensive experience in emergency operations. Marcus wondered who at Fort Blackwater possessed the expertise to manage such a complex rescue operation under these extreme conditions. As dawn approached, the storm began to subside, though the wind and snow continued to create dangerous conditions. Marcus's radio suddenly crackled to life with a clear transmission that made his heart race with relief. "All candidates, this is rescue control. We have teams moving to your positions. Maintain your current locations and prepare for immediate evacuation. Medical teams are standing by." The voice providing the rescue coordination was unmistakably that of Sergeant Chun. Her tone was calm and professional, but Marcus could hear the underlying authority and expertise that he had been observing for months. She was clearly in command of the entire rescue operation, providing detailed instructions to multiple teams and coordinating a complex evacuation that would save the lives of all 8 candidates. Marcus listened in amazement as Sergeant Chun directed helicopter pilots through the treacherous mountain terrain, guided ground rescue teams to the exact locations of injured candidates, and coordinated medical treatment for hypothermia and trauma injuries. Her knowledge was encyclopedic, covering everything from high-altitude rescue techniques to emergency medical procedures. This was not the work of someone whose primary experience was in administrative support. The rescue operation unfolded with military precision. Within 2 hours of the first radio contact, Marcus heard the sound of helicopters approaching his position. The aircraft were being flown by pilots whose skills were extraordinary, navigating through mountain passes in conditions that would challenge even the most experienced aviators. The coordination between air and ground teams was flawless, suggesting a level of tactical expertise that Marcus had never encountered. Marcus's extraction was handled by a team of rescue specialists whose equipment and procedures were clearly military in origin. As they prepared him for helicopter evacuation, he overheard radio communications that confirmed what he had begun to suspect. Sergeant Chun was not simply coordinating the rescue operation. She was commanding it with the authority of someone whose expertise was unquestionable. The helicopter ride to the base medical facility provided Marcus with his first clear view of the scope of the rescue operation. Multiple aircraft were involved, along with ground teams that had moved through the mountains in conditions that would have been impossible for anyone without specialized training. The entire operation was being managed with a level of tactical sophistication that indicated the involvement of elite military personnel. At the medical facility, Marcus was treated for minor hypothermia and exposure, but he was primarily concerned with understanding what had happened during the rescue operation. The medical personnel were professional and efficient, but they revealed nothing about the command structure or personnel involved in the evacuation. Marcus realized that he would need to find other sources of information about the night's events. The debriefing session held the following morning provided Marcus with the first official explanation of what had occurred during the storm. Colonel Hayes addressed all the candidates who had participated in the exercise, explaining that the severe weather had created an emergency situation that required immediate rescue operations. She praised the professionalism of the rescue teams and emphasized that the safety of the candidates was always the primary concern. But what struck Marcus most was the way Colonel Hayes deferred to Sergeant Chun during the technical aspects of the debriefing. When discussing the rescue procedures and tactical decisions that had been made during the operation, the colonel explicitly sought Sergeant Chun's input and acknowledged her expertise in emergency response operations. The dynamic was unmistakable. Sergeant Chun was not simply a participant in the rescue operation. She had been its commander. The rescue operation you experienced last night represents the kind of tactical expertise and operational capability that defines Special Operations Forces, Colonel Hayes explained. The coordination between air and ground teams, the management of multiple casualty evacuations, and the navigation of extreme weather conditions all required skills that are developed through years of specialized training and operational experience. As Colonel Hayes spoke, Marcus noticed that she was essentially describing the capabilities that Sergeant Chun had demonstrated during the rescue operation. The correlation was too obvious to ignore, and Marcus realized that he was finally beginning to understand the true nature of what he had been observing for months. The debriefing continued with technical discussions about rescue procedures and emergency response protocols. Sergeant Chun's contributions to these discussions revealed a depth of knowledge that could only have come from extensive field experience. Her understanding of high-altitude rescue operations, extreme weather procedures, and emergency medical treatment was clearly based on practical experience rather than theoretical training. Marcus found himself studying Sergeant Chun with new understanding during the debriefing. Everything about her demeanor suggested someone who was comfortable with command authority and tactical decision-making. The quiet confidence he had observed for months was not the result of administrative competence, but rather the natural bearing of someone whose expertise had been tested in the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The session concluded with Colonel Hayes announcing that the wilderness survival exercise would be modified for future training groups based on the lessons learned from the emergency situation. The modifications would incorporate new safety protocols and communication procedures that would prevent similar emergencies from occurring. But Marcus noticed that the specific recommendations were coming from Sergeant Chun, whose expertise in emergency operations was being treated as the authoritative source for the new procedures. After the debriefing, Marcus decided to approach Sergeant Chun directly about what he had witnessed during the rescue operation. He found her in the equipment storage area, conducting an inventory of the rescue gear that had been used during the emergency. Her inspection was thorough and professional, examining each piece of equipment for damage or wear that might affect its performance in future operations. Sergeant Chen, Marcus began, uncertain about how to phrase his questions. I wanted to thank you for the rescue operation last night. Your coordination saved all of our lives. Sergeant Chun looked up from her equipment inspection, her expression neutral but alert. The rescue operation was a team effort involving many skilled professionals, she replied. Everyone involved performed their duties with the competence expected of military personnel. Her response was professionally appropriate, but revealed nothing about her specific role in the operation. Marcus decided to be more direct. I heard you coordinating the entire operation over the radio. Your expertise in emergency response and tactical operations was extraordinary. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from administrative training. Sergeant Chun's inspection of the rescue equipment became more focused, as if she were using the task to avoid direct engagement with his observation. Emergency situations require everyone to use whatever skills they possess, she said carefully. Military personnel are trained to adapt to circumstances and contribute to mission success regardless of their primary specialty. The response was tactically correct, but didn't address the specific nature of the expertise she had demonstrated. Marcus pressed further. The rescue operation you commanded last night required capabilities that would be expected from elite special operations personnel. The tactical coordination, the technical knowledge, and the command authority you demonstrated all suggest training and experience that goes far beyond routine military service. Sergeant Chun stopped her equipment inspection and looked directly at Marcus. For the first time since he had known her, her carefully maintained professional facade showed signs of strain. Sometimes military personnel have backgrounds that aren't immediately apparent from their current assignments, she said. The Army uses people's skills in ways that best serve the mission, regardless of their official job description. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who entered the equipment storage area with a serious expression. Sergeant Chen, we need to discuss the after-action report for last night's operation, he said. Colonel Hayes wants your recommendations for modifying the training protocols. Rodriguez's tone was respectful and deferential, treating Sergeant Chen as someone whose expertise was valued highly. Marcus observed the interaction between Rodriguez and Sergeant Chen, noting that their discussion was conducted as equals despite their different official ranks. The conversation involved technical details about rescue operations and tactical procedures that would be expected between senior professionals. Rodriguez was clearly seeking Sergeant Chen's guidance on matters that required specialized knowledge and experience. As Marcus left the equipment storage area, he realized that his investigation had reached a new level of understanding. The rescue operation had provided definitive proof that Sergeant Chen possessed capabilities that were far beyond what her official position would suggest. The question was no longer whether she was more than she appeared to be, but rather how much more and why her true identity was being concealed. That evening, Marcus received an unexpected summons to report to Colonel Hayes's office. The message was brief and provided no indication of the purpose of the meeting, but Marcus suspected that it was related to his continued interest in Sergeant Chen's background. He approached the colonel's office with some apprehension, uncertain about what the meeting would reveal. Colonel Hayes was reviewing operational reports when Marcus entered her office. She gestured for him to take a seat and continued her work for several minutes before speaking. The delay seemed calculated to create an atmosphere of formality and importance, as if the conversation would address significant matters. "Corporal Thompson," Colonel Hayes began, "your performance during the wilderness survival exercise and the emergency that followed has been exceptional. Your leadership under extreme conditions and your ability to maintain tactical effectiveness despite life-threatening circumstances demonstrate the qualities we seek in special operations personnel." Marcus was surprised by the positive evaluation, but he sensed that the colonel's comments were leading to something more significant. "Thank you, ma'am. The training program has been challenging, but I've learned a great deal about my own capabilities and limitations." Colonel Hayes leaned forward, her expression becoming more serious. "Your observations and questions about various aspects of the training program have also been noted. You've demonstrated curiosity about the tactical expertise and operational capabilities that you've witnessed here at Fort Blackwater." The comment confirmed Marcus's suspicion that his investigation into Sergeant Chen's background had been monitored and evaluated. Colonel Hayes was clearly aware of his interest in understanding the source of the exceptional training and tactical expertise he had experienced. "I've noticed that the training program involves personnel with capabilities that seem to exceed their official positions," Marcus replied carefully. "The level of tactical sophistication and operational expertise suggests that some individuals have backgrounds that aren't immediately apparent." Colonel Hayes nodded, as if his observation was exactly what she had expected. Military operations often require the involvement of personnel whose full capabilities and experience aren't reflected in their current assignments. The nature of special operations work sometimes necessitates operational security measures that affect how personnel are officially identified. The explanation was revealing without being specific. Colonel Hayes was confirming that there were indeed personnel at Fort Blackwater whose true backgrounds were concealed, but she wasn't providing details about specific individuals or their actual qualifications. "The rescue operation last night was commanded by someone with extraordinary expertise in emergency response and tactical operations," Marcus said, deciding to be direct about his observations. "That level of capability suggests training and experience that would be expected from elite special operations personnel." Colonel Hayes was quiet for a long moment, as if weighing her response carefully. Sometimes circumstances require individuals to take on responsibilities that exceed their official positions. The safety of military personnel always takes precedence over organizational protocols. The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Marcus realized that he wasn't going to receive the specific information he was seeking. Colonel Hayes was clearly aware of his interest in Sergeant Chen's background, but she was not prepared to provide details about her actual qualifications or previous assignments. The meeting concluded with general guidance about maintaining operational security and focusing on his own training rather than investigating other personnel. But Marcus left Colonel Hayes's office with the understanding that his observations had been accurate and that there were indeed personnel at Fort Blackwater whose true capabilities were being concealed for reasons related to operational security. The following morning brought an announcement that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about Fort Blackwater and the personnel involved in the training program. Colonel Hayes called an emergency assembly of all candidates and training staff, explaining that they would be receiving the visit from senior officials who would be evaluating the training program's effectiveness and operational capabilities. The visiting officials arrived in a convoy of military vehicles that suggested high-level command involvement. Marcus observed the arrival from his barracks window, noting that the vehicles included specialized communication equipment and security personnel that indicated VIP protection protocols. This was clearly not a routine inspection, but rather a visit by officials whose authority was significant. The assembly was held in the main briefing hall, which had been configured to accommodate both the candidates and the visiting officials. Marcus found himself seated near the front of the room, where he could observe the interactions between the visitors and the Fort Blackwater personnel. The dynamic suggested that this was an important evaluation that would have significant consequences for the training program. The senior visiting official was introduced as General Patricia Kane, whose reputation in the special operations community was legendary. General Kane had commanded some of the most successful special operations in recent military history, and her presence at Fort Blackwater indicated that the training program was receiving the highest level of attention and evaluation. General Kane began her presentation by discussing the importance of elite training programs and the need for innovation in special operations preparation. Her comments suggested that she was familiar with the specific training methodologies being used at Fort Blackwater and that she had come to evaluate their effectiveness personally. The training program at Fort Blackwater represents a new approach to special operations preparation, General Kane explained. The integration of advanced tactical scenarios with realistic operational challenges has produced results that exceed our expectations. The candidates graduating from this program are demonstrating capabilities that surpass those of traditionally trained personnel. As General Kane continued her presentation, Marcus noticed that she was occasionally glancing toward the back of the room where the training staff was seated. Her attention seemed to be focused on someone specific, and Marcus followed her gaze to see that she was looking at Sergeant Chun. The exchange of glances suggested recognition and mutual respect between the two women. The presentation continued, with detailed discussions about training methodology and operational effectiveness. General Kane praised the tactical sophistication of the training scenarios and the innovative approach to candidate evaluation. Her comments suggested that she was familiar with the specific details of the training program and that she was impressed by the results being achieved. But it was during the question and answer portion of the presentation that Marcus witnessed something that would fundamentally change his understanding of everything he had observed at Fort Blackwater. General Kane was discussing the tactical innovations that had been implemented in the training program when she made a comment that caused Marcus's heart to race. The training scenarios developed for this program represent some of the most sophisticated tactical thinking I've encountered in my career, General Kane said. The individual responsible for their design possesses an understanding of special operations that is truly exceptional. She paused and looked directly at Sergeant Chun. Major Chun, would you please join me at the podium? The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Major Chun, not Sergeant Chun, but Major Chun. The rank difference represented years of service and levels of responsibility that were completely inconsistent with everything Marcus had believed about her position at Fort Blackwater. He watched in stunned silence as Sergeant Chun rose from her seat and walked to the front of the room. But General Kane wasn't finished with her revelations. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of introducing Major Lisa Chen, who's operational Code name is Phoenix. Major Chun is one of the most decorated special operations officers in our military, with a service record that includes some of the most successful and classified missions in recent history. The room erupted in stunned silence as the implications of General Kane's announcement sank in. Marcus felt as if the world had shifted beneath his feet as he processed the reality of what he was hearing. The quiet, unassuming administrative clerk he had dismissed and mocked for months was actually one of the most elite warriors in the entire military. General Kane continued her introduction with details that made Marcus's earlier arrogance seem even more mortifying. Major Chun has commanded special operations forces in every major theater of operations over the past decade. Her tactical innovations have been adopted throughout the special operations community, and her training methodologies have revolutionized how we prepare elite personnel for combat operations. Marcus listened in horror as General Kane described achievements that represented the pinnacle of military excellence. Major Chun had led rescue operations that saved hundreds of lives, developed tactical procedures that were now standard throughout the military, and commanded forces in situations that most people would consider impossible. The woman he had dismissed as too weak for special operations was actually one of the most capable warriors in the entire military. Major Chun's decision to take on the role of tactical advisor and training designer at Fort Blackwater has been instrumental in developing the most advanced special operations training program in our military, General Kane explained. Her expertise and experience have created training scenarios that prepare candidates for the realities of modern warfare in ways that were previously impossible. The revelation continued with details about Major Chun's background and qualifications. That made Marcus realize the magnitude of his ignorance. She had graduated at the top of her class from the most elite military schools, completed training programs that had failure rates exceeding 90%, and served in units whose very existence was classified. Her expertise was not the result of administrative training, but rather years of operational experience in the most demanding military environments imaginable. As Major Chun stepped to the podium, Marcus observed her with completely new understanding. The quiet confidence he had attributed to administrative competence was actually the natural bearing of someone whose capabilities had been tested in the most extreme circumstances. The technical expertise she had demonstrated was not unusual for someone in her position, but rather exactly what would be expected from one of the most qualified special operations officers in the military. "Thank you, General Kane," Major Chun said, her voice carrying the same calm authority that Marcus had observed for months but never understood. The training program at Fort Blackwater has been designed to prepare candidates for the realities of modern special operations. The scenarios and challenges you've experienced are based on actual operational conditions that you will encounter in the field. Major Chun continued her presentation with insights into the training methodology that revealed the sophistication of the program Marcus had been participating in. Every exercise, every challenge, and every scenario had been carefully designed to test specific capabilities and develop particular skills. The apparent impossibility of many situations had been intentional, designed to push candidates beyond their perceived limitations and reveal their true potential. The rescue operation conducted 2 nights ago during the wilderness survival exercise was not a training scenario, Major Chen explained. It was a real emergency response that required the implementation of actual special operations procedures. The candidates who participated in that exercise experienced the kind of situation they will face in operational environments. The revelation that the rescue operation had been real rather than simulated added another layer to Marcus's understanding of what he had experienced. The extraordinary tactical coordination and professional expertise he had witnessed had been genuine special operations capabilities deployed in a life-threatening situation. Major Chun had not been conducting a training exercise, but rather commanding an actual rescue operation that had saved their lives. Marcus found himself struggling to process the magnitude of the revelations he was hearing. Every assumption he had made about Major Chun, every dismissive comment he had made about her capabilities, and every moment of condescension he had displayed toward her was being revealed as profoundly ignorant arrogance. The woman he had mocked as too weak for special operations was actually someone whose achievements exceeded anything he had ever imagined possible. The presentation concluded with General Kane's announcement that the training program at Fort Blackwater would be expanded and replicated at other facilities throughout the military. The success of the program was attributed directly to Major Chun's expertise and innovation, and she was being promoted to oversee the development of advanced training programs throughout the special operations community. As the assembly was dismissed, Marcus remained in his seat, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had learned. The past months of his training took on completely new meaning when viewed through the lens of understanding who had actually been designing and overseeing his preparation. The challenges he had faced, the expertise he had witnessed, and the tactical sophistication he had experienced had all been the work of someone whose qualifications were truly exceptional. The realization of his own ignorance and arrogance was crushing. Marcus thought about every dismissive comment he had made about Major Chun's capabilities, every moment when he had assumed she was unsuited for military excellence, and every time he had failed to recognize the extraordinary nature of what he was witnessing. The shame was overwhelming, but it was also the beginning of a fundamental transformation in his understanding of what military service really meant. Over the following days, Marcus found himself reflecting on the lessons he had learned through his experience at Fort Blackwater. The most important lesson was not about tactical procedures or physical training, but rather about the danger of making assumptions about others based on superficial observations. Major Chun had demonstrated that true capability was not always visible on the surface, and that the most extraordinary people were often those who didn't need to prove their worth to others. The training program continued, but Marcus approached it with a completely different mindset. Instead of focusing on his own superiority and the weaknesses he perceived in others, he began to look for the hidden strengths and capabilities that might not be immediately apparent. The lesson Major Chun had taught him through her example was that excellence came in many forms, and that the most dangerous mistake was to underestimate someone based on their appearance or apparent position. As Marcus prepared to graduate from the training program and move on to active special operations service, he carried with him the understanding that his time at Fort Blackwater had been about much more than tactical training. It had been about learning to see beyond surface appearances and recognizing that the most important qualities in military service were often the ones that were not immediately visible. The final ceremony at Fort Blackwater was held on a crisp morning with the Rocky Mountains providing a dramatic backdrop. Marcus stood with his fellow candidates as they received their certifications and prepared to join the elite ranks of special operations personnel. The achievement was significant, but Marcus understood that the real education he had received was about character, humility, and the importance of never underestimating others. Major Chun presented the certificates to each graduating candidate, offering individual comments about their performance and potential. When she reached Marcus, she paused and looked at him directly. "Corporal Thompson, you have demonstrated the capacity for growth and learning that will serve you well in special operations. The ability to recognize your own limitations and learn from them is one of the most important qualities you can possess." Marcus met her gaze with the respect and admiration that should have been evident from the beginning of his training. "Thank you, Major Chun. You've taught me lessons that go far beyond tactical training. I understand now that true strength comes in many forms, and that the most dangerous mistake is to judge others based on superficial observations." Major Chun nodded, and Marcus thought he saw a flicker of satisfaction in her expression. The best warriors are those who never stop learning and never assume they have nothing left to discover. Remember that lesson. and it will serve you well throughout your career. As Marcus left Fort Blackwater to begin his special operations career, he carried with him the understanding that his time there had fundamentally changed his perspective on military service and human capability. The quiet, unassuming woman he had initially dismissed had proven to be one of the most extraordinary individuals he had ever encountered. The lessons she had taught him about the danger of assumptions and the importance of recognizing hidden strength would guide him throughout his career. Years later, as Marcus found himself in leadership positions within the special operations community, he would encounter young soldiers who reminded him of his former self. When he saw arrogance and assumptions about others' capabilities, he would share the story of Major Lisa Chun and the lessons he had learned at Fort Blackwater. The story became a teaching tool about the importance of humility, the danger of judging others based on appearances, and the recognition that true excellence often comes in forms that are not immediately apparent. The legacy of Major Chun's teaching extended far beyond the specific tactical skills she had imparted. Her greatest contribution was the demonstration that the most important qualities in military service were character, humility, and the recognition that every person possessed capabilities that might not be immediately visible. This lesson, learned through the humbling experience of discovering his own ignorance, became the foundation of Marcus's approach to leadership and service throughout his career. Marcus's transformation from an arrogant recruit to a humble professional was complete, but the lessons learned at Fort Blackwater would continue to influence his perspective and actions throughout his life. The experience had taught him that true strength was not about physical capability or obvious achievements, but rather about the quiet competence and hidden excellence that characterized the most exceptional individuals in any field. 5 years had passed since Marcus Thompson graduated from Fort Blackwater, and his career in special operations had taken him to conflicts across 3 continents. He had led teams through hostile territory, coordinated complex rescue missions, and earned the respect of his peers through consistent excellence under pressure. The arrogant recruit who had once mocked a maintenance sergeant had evolved into a seasoned professional, whose leadership was sought after throughout the special operations community. Marcus now held the rank of captain and was stationed at Fort Bragg, where he served as an instructor in the Army's most advanced tactical training program. His reputation for developing young soldiers and instilling proper military values had made him one of the most requested mentors in the special operations pipeline. But more than his tactical expertise, Marcus was known for his ability to humble overconfident recruits and teach them the importance of recognizing excellence in unexpected places. The lesson he had learned from Major Lisa Chun had become the cornerstone of his teaching philosophy. Every training cycle brought new candidates who reminded Marcus of his former self, soldiers whose confidence had been built on physical prowess and academic achievements, but who lacked the wisdom to recognize capability in others. These moments provided Marcus with opportunities to share the most important lesson of his military career. On a humid morning in North Carolina, Marcus stood before a group of 30 special operations candidates who had just completed their initial assessment. Weak, the young soldiers carried themselves with the familiar mixture of pride and anticipation that Marcus remembered from his own early days. Among them was Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez, a former college athlete whose performance had been exemplary, but whose attitude toward support personnel showed the same dismissive arrogance that Marcus had once displayed. Rodriguez had been making comments throughout the week about the civilian contractors and administrative staff who supported the training program. Her remarks were not overtly disrespectful, but they revealed an assumption that anyone not directly involved in combat operations was somehow lesser than those who carried weapons and conducted missions. Marcus recognized the mindset immediately and knew that it represented a dangerous blind spot that could prove costly in operational environments. The training facility at Fort Bragg employed several retired military personnel in civilian capacities, providing expertise and continuity that enhanced the program's effectiveness. Among them was Dr. Sarah Kim, a quiet woman in her 50s who managed the facility's medical research program and provided specialized instruction in combat medicine. Dr. Kim's demeanor was professional but unassuming, and she moved through the facility with the same kind of quiet efficiency that Marcus remembered observing in Major Chun. Rodriguez had been particularly dismissive of Dr. Kim, referring to her as just a medic and questioning why combat soldiers needed to learn advanced medical procedures from a civilian contractor. Her comments were overheard by other candidates who began to adopt similar attitudes toward the medical training components of their program. Marcus recognized that the situation required intervention before the candidates' arrogance led them to miss valuable learning opportunities. The opportunity came during a complex medical training scenario designed to test the candidates' ability to provide emergency care under combat conditions. The exercise involved simulated casualties with multiple trauma injuries, requiring rapid assessment and treatment decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Dr. Kim was overseeing the training, providing real-time feedback on medical procedures and tactical considerations. Rodriguez approached the first simulated casualty with confidence, immediately beginning treatment procedures that she had learned during her previous medical training. Her technique was competent but routine, following standard protocols without considering the specific tactical situation or environmental factors that might affect patient care. Dr. Kim observed quietly, taking notes but not immediately intervening. The scenario became more complex as additional casualties were introduced, and the candidates were required to prioritize treatment while managing limited medical supplies. Rodriguez found herself struggling with decisions that required balancing immediate medical needs against tactical considerations and resource limitations. Her standard medical training had not prepared her for the kind of complex decision-making required in combat environments. Dr. Kim stepped forward as Rodriguez hesitated over a particularly difficult triage decision. "Staff Sergeant, you're treating these casualties as if you're in a hospital emergency room," she observed quietly. "But in combat, medical decisions must account for tactical realities and resource constraints that don't exist in civilian medical environments." Rodriguez looked up from her patient with a mixture of frustration and defensive pride. "Ma'am, I've completed advanced emergency medical training. These procedures are standard across all military medical protocols." Her response revealed the same kind of arrogance that Marcus had once displayed when his expertise was questioned by someone he perceived as less qualified. Dr. Kim's expression remained patient as she knelt beside the simulated casualty. "Standard protocols are important, but combat medicine requires adaptations that aren't taught in routine training programs. Watch how environmental factors affect this patient's condition." She began demonstrating advanced procedures that Rodriguez had never seen before, explaining complex medical concepts while simultaneously addressing tactical considerations. Marcus watched the exchange with growing recognition of the parallel to his own experience at Fort Blackwater. Rodriguez was demonstrating the same inability to recognize exceptional expertise when it came from an unexpected source. Dr. Kim's medical knowledge was clearly far beyond routine training levels, but Rodriguez was too focused on her own capabilities to appreciate what she was witnessing. The medical scenario continued with Dr. Kim providing increasingly sophisticated instruction that revealed depths of knowledge and experience that extended far beyond routine medical training. Her understanding of combat trauma was encyclopedic, covering everything from advanced surgical techniques to psychological trauma management. Her ability to adapt medical procedures to tactical situations demonstrated experience that could only have come from extensive field operations. Rodriguez found herself completely outmatched by the complexity of the medical scenarios Dr. Kim was presenting. The decision-making required went far beyond her previous training, incorporating factors she had never considered and requiring knowledge she didn't possess. Her confidence began to crumble as she realized that her assumptions about the medical training program had been completely wrong. The turning point came when Dr. Kim demonstrated a complex procedure for treating traumatic brain injuries under combat conditions. Her technique was flawless, and her explanation revealed intimate knowledge of neurosurgical principles that would be expected from someone with extensive medical training and operational experience. Rodriguez watched in amazement as Dr. Kim performed procedures that she had never encountered, even in advanced military medical courses. After the exercise, Marcus approached Rodriguez for a private conversation. He had observed her growing realization that Dr. Kim possessed capabilities far beyond what her civilian contractor status would suggest, and he recognized that this was a teachable moment that could fundamentally change Rodriguez's perspective on military service and human capability. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, what did you think of today's medical training? Marcus asked as they walked toward the debriefing area. Rodriguez was clearly struggling to process what she had witnessed, and her usual confidence had been replaced by confusion and uncertainty. Sir, I don't understand how a civilian contractor knows medical procedures that I've never encountered. In military training, Rodriguez replied. Dr. Kim's knowledge seems to exceed what would be expected from someone in her position. Her observation was accurate, but Marcus could see that she was still trying to reconcile what she had witnessed with her assumptions about civilian support personnel. Marcus smiled, remembering his own similar confusion when confronted with Major Chun's unexpected expertise. Sometimes the most capable people are not the ones you would expect, Staff Sergeant. Military service brings together individuals with diverse backgrounds and experiences that aren't always reflected in their current positions. The conversation continued as Marcus began to share the story of his experience at Fort Blackwater and the lessons he had learned from Major Chun. He described his own arrogance and the assumptions he had made about a maintenance sergeant who turned out to be one of the most elite warriors in the military. Rodriguez listened with growing understanding as Marcus explained how dangerous it could be to underestimate others based on superficial observations. The story of Major Chun's true identity and the rescue operation she had commanded provided Rodriguez with a powerful example of how exceptional capabilities could be hidden behind ordinary appearances. Marcus emphasized that the most important lesson he had learned was the danger of judging others based on their apparent position or status rather than observing their actual capabilities and contributions. Over the following days, Rodriguez's attitude toward the training program and support personnel underwent a dramatic transformation. She approached Dr. Kim with genuine respect and curiosity, asking questions about her background and experience that revealed a new appreciation for the expertise being provided. The change in Rodriguez's behavior was noticed by other candidates, who began to follow her example in showing proper respect for all training personnel. The investigation that Rodriguez conducted into Dr. Kim's background revealed information that paralleled Marcus's discovery about Major Chun. Dr. Kim was actually Dr. Sarah Kim, a former Army surgeon who had served with Special Operations Forces for over 15 years before transitioning to civilian service. Her medical expertise had been developed during deployments to every major conflict of the past 2 decades, and her knowledge of combat trauma was based on treating thousands of wounded soldiers under the most demanding conditions imaginable. The revelation about Dr. Kim's background provided Rodriguez with the same kind of humbling experience that Marcus had undergone at Fort Blackwater. The quiet civilian contractor she had dismissed was actually one of the most experienced combat surgeons in the military medical community, whose expertise was sought after by special operations units throughout the world. Her decision to work as a civilian contractor was motivated by a desire to train the next generation of combat medics rather than seeking recognition for her own achievements. Marcus used Rodriguez's transformation as a teaching opportunity for the entire training group. During a group discussion about military leadership and professional development, he shared the stories of both Major Chun and Dr. Kim as examples of how exceptional people often chose to serve in ways that didn't seek attention or recognition. The lesson resonated with the candidates, who began to approach their training with greater humility and respect for everyone involved in their preparation. The impact of these lessons extended beyond the immediate training environment. Rodriguez and her fellow candidates carried the understanding they had gained into their subsequent assignments, where they applied the principle of never underestimating others based on superficial observations. The lesson became part of their leadership philosophy, influencing how they treated subordinates, peers, and support personnel throughout their careers. Marcus's reputation as an instructor continued to grow, but he understood that his most important contribution was not tactical training but character development. The lesson he had learned from Major Chun about recognizing hidden excellence had become the foundation of his approach to developing young soldiers. Every training cycle provided new opportunities to humble overconfident recruits and teach them the importance of respect and humility. Years later, Rodriguez found herself in a position similar to Marcus's, serving as an instructor in special operations training programs. She encountered young soldiers whose arrogance reminded her of her own former attitude, and she used the lessons she had learned from Marcus and the examples of Major Chun and Dr. Kim to teach them about recognizing capability in unexpected places. The story of Major Chun's hidden identity became a legend within the special operations community, passed down from instructor to student as a cautionary tale about the danger of assumptions. But more than just a story, it became a principle that influenced how special operations personnel approached their interactions with others throughout their careers. Marcus's own career continued to flourish, but he measured his success not by his personal achievements, but by the number of young soldiers he had helped to develop proper perspectives on military service and human capability. The transformation he had undergone at Fort Blackwater had become the foundation for transforming others, creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond his individual influence. The lesson that true strength came in many forms and that the most dangerous mistake was to judge others based on appearances had become institutionalized within the training programs Marcus influenced. New candidates learned not just tactical skills, but the importance of humility, respect, and the recognition that exceptional people often served in ways that didn't seek attention or acclaim. The legacy of Major Lisa Chun extended far beyond her individual achievements in special operations. Through the soldiers she had taught directly and the lessons that were passed down through instructors like Marcus, her influence continued to shape military culture and values throughout the special operations community. The principle she had demonstrated that excellence was its own reward, and that the most important work often happened without recognition had become a cornerstone of professional military education. Marcus often reflected on how different his career might have been if he had not learned the lessons that Major Chun taught him through her example at Fort Blackwater. The arrogance and assumptions that had characterized his early military service could have led to failures in leadership and missed opportunities for learning throughout his career. Instead, the humbling experience of discovering his own ignorance had become the foundation for a lifetime of continued growth and effective leadership. The story continued to unfold with each new generation of soldiers who learned these lessons and carried them forward into their own careers and leadership positions. The principle that the most exceptional people were often those who didn't need to prove their worth to others had become a lasting part of military culture, influencing how soldiers approached their service and their relationships with others throughout their careers. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.